Hello everyone, today I will repeat essentially what I read in a recent live stream participation to the YouTube channel Eastern Roman History. I recorded today, December the 15th. That is the 1000th year anniversary of the death of Basil II. I was gently invited by Eastern Roman History to make an intervention. There were some slots you could book about sort of different themes of Basil II's reign. I picked southern Italy, mostly because I liked the idea of bringing a bit of that sort of comparison that we usually make on the channel between sort of Western and Eastern identity. Let's put it in this way. I managed, I also made a post on YouTube in which I address you to the link of the stream, in which I managed, of course, in completely amicable and just sort of veiled ways, that kind of relative criticism regarding the ultimate shortcoming and or insufficiency of sort of Byzantine, in this case, Byzantine presence in Italy, essentially at the end of the 10th, the early 11th century. This was actually the acme of the empire by some standards. We can't talk which one is historic, like in absolute and relative terms this were, because of the reign of Basil II, of course, was a giant in Byzantine history, and that will greatly expand also through a relentless military, but also administrative effort to, in fact, not just reaffirm Byzantine universal dominance in great part of the Mediterranean and beyond, but also to essentially salvage that system that will actually collapse after his death in the following generations. So, you know, we made multiple videos on Byzantine history. Actually, I was thinking that I could have used the script of a video made years ago regarding the sustainability of the conquest. That is to say, that there has been some debate in Byzantine historiography regarding the supportability of Basil II's expansion. Because when you look at these great empires of tendentially ecumenic scale, you, of course, appreciate their power, the fact that there was something evidently and fundamentally working. But that, however, still in circling expansionistic terms, costs a freaking lot. And it's also difficult, telling the truth. This is another topic I could have, I don't know, the streaming there is still continuing, so I don't have, and I think there is time, if anything, we could organize something else about this topic. It's how, other sort of famous topic in general, not just in medievalistics, how can you actually, how assess, like in a precise sense, the extent of a political territorial dominion in any sort of direct sense. Like I was looking at, for example, the images that I was downloading today for preparing this video regarding properly the map of the Byzantine Empire at the time of Basil II. And I realized that if people just look at these maps and say, oh, look at how big it was, but they often don't focus. I'm not criticizing anyone in the stream there. Actually, it's pretty good intervention there that are worth being listened to by everyone, host included, of course. The channel specializes in, as he call it, at least Eastern Roman history. Of course, I don't criticize the terminology there, but if anything, these are topics that are very well covered. And again, this illusion at some point that the Byzantine Empire was essentially of the same measure of its nominal sort of geographical extent, which is valid actually for basically any power at the time, but in the case of the Byzantines, it was quite peculiarly more meaningful as an assessment. For reasons that we know very well, if you followed my channel, I, over the years, really went looking at essentially what does it mean to have a direct control in the Middle Ages, but also what was the alchemy, the combination, the formula, the ingredients behind Byzantine dominion. It was largely essentially a Greek culture, still based since classical antiquity on essentially a coastal domination, right? The West was fundamentally different in a truly ethno-territorial pattern, right? The Romans historically had properly molded ethno-linguistically the entire West and sort of expanded properly in the continent as the greatest sort of feat of their sort of what the Byzantines would have called Sebastocratic elevation of their conquered peoples to the same Roman altar of the gods. And we will talk more about this, of course, in other videos. So this is not, in fact, the first video I make at all about Basil II. What am I doing now? Said, but Schwerpunkt, you actually made the video already today. Like you're repeating the same script, yes, but I don't want to simply copy the track from Eastern Roman history. I could easily do it, singling out my own intervention. It's not a problem, right? The main problem actually is that I had just 1 hour slot, which was perfectly fine. I didn't even know how long my text would be. It's my fault. I thought it would last like 30-40 minutes. I went on talking for an hour, then we had a lovely chat, but there wasn't much to expand on. And you know that I treat my followers in a bit of a sort of more critical, analytical sense whenever I have the opportunity. So I will make a longer intervention to explain better, even for anyone who has, for example, just met me from Eastern Roman history, like what this is about. I would also like to stress, and I will probably create now a playlist about Basil II, that I made 3 videos about him already for a total of essentially 3 hours. Which, you know, could have been 6 given Schwerpunkt. Today we will add more to him, because we didn't really talk so much about him, his reign, etc. Like now with the military biographies, with this kind of new series, the new kind of video that I introduced this year. Probably we'll start covering Byzantine emperors. They're, especially like a figure like Basil II, it's so pricelessly necessary in so many ways. So today I will basically repeat for you, if you haven't listened to the video, the same exact script that I used, that I also sent to Eastern Roman history privately via email during our sort of prodromic, just to use Greek sounding names for this video, connection, giving him complete consent for using it however he wants, right? So provided that he's aware of the sources that I gave. In fact, in the stream, we're talking about Gay, l'Italie méridionale et l'Empire byzantin, Catherine Holmes, Basil II, and governments of the empire. It's a mix. The best study is Vera von Falkenhausen's Between Two Empires, Southern Italy in the Reign of Basil II, Brill 2003. Then I grabbed something from here and there, whenever, especially there was something military. For example, Nicole's The Crusading Era, Arms and Armor, Crusading Era, does talk a bit about the Southern Italian urban militias. They're a very interesting topic. In fact, in the script, I haven't even properly put much of that. In any case, it's an original script, and again, I gave permission only to Eastern Roman history. If you want permission, like, just ask me, and you're not granted to be given that. There was a favor just for having been hosted, chosen. Like I never ask people to interview me, to make me participate in things. But as you've seen also last year with Veritas and Caritas, that was a nice thing, and it can help also gaining the channel's visibility. So I will be stopping probably more than I did in the other video, because there are some interesting things we can comment on. If anything, I can do it at the end, but there are some things that are very important. The script is fairly long. It will take yet probably another hour to read. Here we go. So the 50 years of Basil II's personal rule, 976-1025, constitute the clearest possible demonstration of how completely the fate of Byzantine Italy was subordinated to the empire's simultaneous crisis on every other front. Byzantine Italy in this period consisted only of 2 disconnected regions in the far south of the peninsula, Calabria and Longobardia, the latter the official imperial name for the remaining Byzantine possessions in Apulia and adjacent areas, forming the westernmost remnants of Roman territory on the Italian peninsula. Calabria, the toe of Italy, essentially modern Calabria and southern part of modern Basilicata, almost uniformly Greek-speaking, Chalcedonian Orthodox, and subject to the ecclesiastical authority of Constantinople. There would be something to say about this, because it's not 100%, but more or less as far as mostly imperial administration is concerned. Yes, there were Greek Chalcedonian. The interland was actually Italic, but Calabria also has a pretty rough interland, so it's different from Apulia that has a massive, in fact, Latin interland, as we will see now. It changes everything in the game, but still, just this for saying, because people tend to conflate, if anything, even primarily for racial bias, I don't know, the Greeks with Italians, and especially also language in these regions that is actually not mixed at all, right? And while there are Greek islands still, I think, in southern Italy that date, by the way, to this period, right? The High Middle Ages. That's not like in the older Greek colonies. These are minimal. They're 0 point something percent of the population. There are much bigger minorities in southern Italy from also other historical things, such as Albanians. These were refugees. I mean, not Albanians, but modern immigrants from, after the Cold War. I mean, historical Albanian communities of refugees fleeing in the 15th century, obviously to Naples in the west, to the Ottoman onslaught. Right, we'll talk more about that because we haven't made so many videos of medieval Albania, but it's very interesting. Right, there are also other groups that deserve. But again, there's this notion that Greeks and Romans were somehow similar, that Greeks and Italics and Italians were later similar, is completely nonsensical. They're two radically separated branches of the not just on the European war, but there is a point that escapes to people that Mediterranean peoples are much more diversified between one another than, say, comparatively Northern European. So that, for example, I don't know, even Italian and Spanish, that linguistically they're very similar, but it's also because of context, definitely true after the Roman Empire, etc. But they are, say, in a broader cultural identity, ethnic, very different peoples. Right, and in this sense, like, we tend to forget how, for example, similar languages can continue also on similar grounds. But when we talk civilization, culture, identity, the language itself, at the end of the day, we should be extremely more careful about lots of other things, especially if you are aware of linguistic diversification degrees in Europe. Now, this is something that I wasn't stopping today during the streaming about, but it's important, and that's also the reason why we have to talk a bit more about southern Italy, because that's the one that is normally singled out due to sort of historical issues still today, due to the fact that it's basically, from an economical point of view, it's a post-socialist country, even though there was no socialism. And strikingly jarring with northern central Italy that are really rich, not just in comparison. Now, Lombardia. Essentially, the old Lombard Duchy of Benevent reduced to the coastal plain of Apulia, the Terra di Bari, northern Basilicata, overwhelmingly Latin-speaking, governed by Lombard law, faithful to the Roman rite, and culturally far closer, in fact, to the neighboring Lombard principalities of Capua Benevent, Salerno, and Naples, that to the distant imperial capital. From the late 9th century onward, the imperial administration had pragmatically accepted this duality. Greek law, Greek clergy, and Greek liturgy prevailed in Calabria. In Apulia, catepans from Greek Catepano, the governor-general of the whole of Byzantine Italy, and strategoi, military governors of individual cities or districts, routinely confirmed local Lombard gastals, that is, the Lombard administrative officials, and judices, that is, the judges, signing charters alongside Latin notaries, and the Latin liturgy undisturbed except during the short-lived and largely unsuccessful Hellenizing drive of Nicephorus II Phocas, 963-969, who briefly ordered Latin rites, suppressed, as Liutprand of Cremona says, in omni Apulia seu Calabria, and created a new Greek metropolitan see at Otranto with suffragans at Acerenza, Tursi, Gravina, Matera, and Tricarico, most of which quickly reverted to Latin usage after his death. I would like to stress two things. Of course, when you use here Latin and Greek, you understand they mean languages, all right? And not, in fact, some necessary ethnic, as we'll see now, aspect. Secondly, in some of the maps I use, because they are the ones you normally find around to be used with the Creative Commons commercial license, you have I'm probably going to use this also in the thumbnail, this notion that this choice made by the map maker to show Apulia and Calabria, essentially Byzantine Apulia and Calabria contiguously colored with a Byzantine purple, right, for that territory. In between, telling the truth, the Longobard interland was quite autonomous. There is, of course, a degree by which you can debate the extent, because the more south, the Longobards had arrived themselves up to Calabria back in the day, and even fairly south. And so Basilicata, its interland, and the other largely mountainous southern Italian interland is sort of nominally Byzantine, but there were just some Longobard duchies in the north that were fully sort of, or at least to a degree, recognized independent, although they became client states of the empire at some point, because they were, in any case, in this fringe a bit with the west, a bit with the east, by political convenience. But in any case, that's one of the approximations I was talking about at the beginning. Like, what does it mean to consider some of those lands uniformly sort of Byzantine in the map? That's an important choice that eventually is going to reflect on people who look at the map without sort of understanding the difficulties of representing definitely the same thing in a sort of more precisely historical sense. Bishops and archbishops everywhere were local men. Many Apulian sees were deliberately raised to autocephalous archbishoprics, such as Bari, Trani, Siponto, to free them from the Longobard metropolitan of Beneventum, largely independent of both Rome and Benevent. And catapans showered lavish donations on Latin monasteries, including the great Abbey of Monte Cassino, the most important Benedictine house in southern Italy, situated beyond the frontier in the Principality of Capua. Papal involvement in southern Italian affairs was remarkably weak and intermittent, with Rome arriving by local aristocratic factions and direct papal influence over Byzantine churches being minimal. Only in the very last years, when Basil Boioannes founded Troia and persuaded Pope John XIX, 1024-1032, to take the new diocese directly under Roman jurisdiction, did a tentative reassertion of papal interest appear. The single command of the Catapanate of Italy centered on Bari, the main Byzantine port and administrative capital on the Adriatic coast of Apulia, emerged in the 60s of the 10th century as a direct response to Ottonian penetration. The Ottonian dynasty, Otto I ruling between 936 and 973, Otto II up to 983, and Otto III up to 1002, sought to revive the Western Roman Empire and dominate the entire Italian peninsula. The Patricius Eugenius may already have exercised unified authority in the late 960s when confronting Otto I's attempt to extend influence over the Longobard princes. The office is securely attested by 970 and appears without qualification in the Escorial Tacticon, alongside the ducates of Antioch, Mesopotamia, Thessaloniki, and Adrianople. Yet the Catapanate remained highly elastic. When the center was under extreme pressure, the post could be left vacant for years, most of the 990s and the early 1000s. Its functions temporarily assumed by the senior tagmatic officer at Bari, usually from the regiment of the excubitores or Icanati. Were imperial guards, by the way. That tells you how relevant, in the sense, Bari as the cornerstone of southern Italian domination really was for the Byzantines, or by the separate strategos of Calabria. Senior appointments in the difficult decades were brief and unstable. Calocurus Delphinus, 982-983, John Amiropoulos, 988-989, Gregory Tercaneiotis, 998-1006, Basil Mesardonitus, 1010-1016, and many others rarely held office longer than 12 or 18 months. The Catapanate was governed through a flexible mixture of general Byzantine institutions grafted onto older thematic structures and local practices. At the top stood the Catapan, when one was actually appointed, as we've just seen, a senior general sent from Constantinople who combined military, judicial, and fiscal authority. Beneath him, the old thematic apparatus survived, strategoi of Calabria, and until the early 11th century of Longobardia, turmarchs, judges, cretae, protonotarioi, cartularioi, and a host of minor officials, many of them local men bearing Greek titles but signing documents in Latin. Apulia retained large zones governed by Longobard law and Longobard gastels or judices, while Greek law prevailed in Calabrian parts of the Salento. The Catapans and Stratagoi explicitly recognized this duality with privileges granted to the new towns of the Capitanata in 1019 to 1024, guaranteeing the settlers, quote, their Lombard law and customs while Greek law continued in neighboring districts. Mixed courts were common. Bilingual documents, Greek and Latin on the same sheet, appear from the 990s onward, and judges freely cited whichever code suited the parties. We made an entire series about medieval law back in the day. We discussed how law worked, in fact, at the time in practice. Taxation was collected in cash and kind through a combination of Constantinopolitan officials and indigenous notables. Recipes such as the 1016 Apodaixis from Palagiano show that even remote communities sometimes paid the capitan directly. After 1018, Boioannes introduced a more aggressive centralized style. New fortresses were administered by imperial comites, garrisons were strengthened with troops from the central army, and the catapan began to intervene directly in ecclesiastical appointments and urban privileges. The system worked remarkably well while strong catapans and adequate resources were available, but it remained critically dependent on Constantinople and never fully replaced local power structures. The legal landscape was one of deliberate and pragmatic pluralism that reflected the mixed population and the empire's limited administrative reach. Two parallel systems coexisted without serious conflict: the basilica, the ecloga, and later novels in Greek zones. The old Lombard law of the Edict of Rotary and the later Carolingian capitularies in most of Lombard Apulia for inheritance, dowry, land transfer, and criminal cases, so the foundational one. Ecclesiastical law was equally flexible. Latin Rite bishops and monasteries in Apulia followed Roman canon law, while Greek monasteries in Calabria obeyed Constantinopolitan synodal decrees. Only in taxation and high justice did Constantinople insist on uniformity. This flexible accommodation, far more tolerant than the later 11th century attempts at Hellenization, helps explain why religious or legal grievances almost never appear as motives for revolt. The great uprisings of Melus were driven by fiscal and political, not legal or cultural resentment. For the first 3.5 decades of Basil's reign, southern Italy was repeatedly sacrificed. The civil wars of 976 to 89, the long Bulgarian War that absorbed the main field army from 986 until 1018, and the simultaneous need to hold Syria against the Fatimids left almost no regular troops available for the West. For most of the reign, the military presence was strikingly thin and defensive in character. Until the final decade, the Catapanate possessed no large standing field army. Defense relied on local themed troops, urban militias, especially strong in Bari, small tagmatic garrisons, namely the Scolex, Cubitores, Icanati, and occasional detachments from the naval themes of Cephalonia or Samos. Long stretches in the 990s saw no catapan at all. Islamic raids from Sicily, then under the Kalbid dynasty nominally subject to the Fatimids, and Ifriqiya became almost annual events, with Gerace, Cosenza, Gravina, Matera, Oria, and the suburbs of Bari itself repeatedly sacked or besieged between 976 and 1009. The Annals of Bari, Lupus Protospatarius, Venetian chronicles, and occasional Arabic sources record the rhythm with painful precision. Gravina and Oria, sacked in 976-977, Matera devastated, Gerace briefly occupied, and Cosenza's walls destroyed. In 986, repeated direct assaults on Bari in 988 and 1003. Cosenza reoccupied for several months in 1009. The hinterland of Bari reduced to misery by 992, according to a contemporary landowner near Conversano. Calabria bled population on a massive scale. Entire monasteries transplanted themselves to the Lombard principalities, to Rome, or even to Thessaloniki. Individual saints, Vitalis, Sabas the Younger, Nalus of Rossano, Christopher and Macarius, Luke of Demenna, Nicodemus, Gregory of Cassano, Fantinus fled north or east. Greek monks and artisans appear, founding new communities at Monte Cassino, Gaeta, Naples, and as far afield as Cologne. Apulia, somewhat better shielded by distance and by the permanent tagmatic garrison at Bari, suffered less demographic loss but descended into near anarchy among its own archontes, that is, local Lombard or Greco-Lombard notables. The annals chronicle an almost unbroken sequence of assassinations, coups, and factional struggles. 979, the Protospatarius Porphyrius murders Bishop Andrew of Oria. 982, the brothers Sergius and Theophylact surrender Bari to Capitan Calocurus Delphinus. 987, the Protospatarius Sergius is murdered by the citizens of Bari. 989, the Catapan John Amiropoulos executes the Icanatos Leo, the Crites Nicholas, and the Protospatarius Porphyrius. 990, the Excubitores Pubalis and Peter are killed. 997, the Excubitor Macrotheodorus is murdered at Oria by the brothers Smaragdus and Peter. 998, the Crites Busitus barely escapes a coup. 999, Catapan Gregory Tarcheneiotes besieges Gravina and captures Theophylact. 1000, Smaragdus was finally taken and punished. Some of these local notables openly collaborated with Islamic raiders, others oscillated between Byzantine and Western imperial allegiance. For the first 35 years of the Western powers were overwhelmingly predators rather than partners. The Calbid emirs of Sicily, operating from Palermo and Mazara and supported by the Fatimid fleet out of Mahdia and Tripoli, treated Byzantine Calabria and Apulia as an open raiding ground. The Ottonians regarded southern Italy as a legitimate sphere of Western imperial influence. Otto I had already forced the Lombard princes into clientelage in the 960s. Otto II invaded the Catapanate in 982 with the proclaimed intention of expelling the Muslims, only to suffer catastrophic defeat at Stilo in Byzantine Calabria at the hands of the same Sicilian emir whose raids had provoked his expedition. The battle killed both the emir and the princes of Capua and Benevent, inadvertently removing the most dangerous organized opponents of Byzantine rule and allowing the Catapano Calocurus Delphinus to recover lost ground in northern Apulia. Yet the Western emperors never abandoned their claims. Otto III pursued a Byzantine marriage alliance in the late 990s, while simultaneously competing for control of Rome and the Lombard courts. And Henry II would march south in 1021-1022 with the explicit aim of dismantling the new Byzantine order in the Capitanata. Relations with the German emperors, the Holy Roman Empire, thus oscillated between intense rivalry and pragmatic detente, though direct German intervention ceased for almost 20 years after Otto III's death in 1002. The Lombard principalities oscillated between the two empires, the indigenous Lombard, that is Latin-speaking Roman Rite population of Apulia, and the neighboring independent Lombard principalities, Capua, Benevento, Salerno, Naples, formed the single largest ethnic and political component of the region. Inside the Byzantine Catapanate, they supplied most of the local judiciary, tourmarks, and urban notables, and their law continued to be applied in large parts of Apulia alongside Greek law. Periods of cooperation alternated with sharp resistance. Capua, Benevent, and Salerno repeatedly served as refuges for anti-Byzantine rebels, Melus of Bari in 1011 and again in 1017, and as staging posts for German intervention. At the same time, their rulers were perfectly willing to become Byzantine clients when circumstances favored it. Pandulf IV of Capua, the most predatory of them all, formally submitted to Basil Boioannes after Cannae in 1018, handed over the golden keys of his city, and fought alongside imperial troops until Henry II temporarily deposed him in 1022. The smaller maritime cities, Naples, Gaeta, and above all Amalfi, pursued a more consistently pro-Byzantine line driven by trading privileges in Constantinople and the need for mutual defense against Islamic piracy. Only Venice among the Western powers functioned as a genuine strategic partner for most of the reign. The Chrysobull of March 992 granted Venice a drastic reduction of commercial dues at Constantinople and Abydos in return for a perpetual obligation to transport imperial troops to southern Italy whenever summoned. The alliance was sealed around 1004 by the marriage of the Doge's son John to Maria Argyropulina, a close relative of the emperor. Venetian ships duly relieved the prolonged Islamic siege of Bari in 1002-3, crucial context provided by the Storia Venetorum of John the Deacon, finished around 1008. Peasant vessels assisted the defense of Reggio in 1006. These Italian maritime cities, not the imperial navy which barely existed in the western Mediterranean, were the true bulwark against Calbid and Fatimid sea power. Defense therefore depended almost entirely on diplomacy and allied fleets with gifts dispatched to the Calbid emir of Sicily and embassies exchanged with the Umayyad Caliph at Cordoba, revealing parallel attempts to purchase Muslim forbearance or to set one Muslim power against another. Byzantine southern Italy was a profoundly bilingual and bicultural society whose fault lines did not yet run along the sharp Greek versus Latin divide of the later 11th century, in a zone of striking religious coexistence and fluidity rather than sharp confessional conflict. In Calabria and the Salento, the population was overwhelmingly Greek-speaking, Chalcedonian, and tied to a dense network of villages, monasteries, and small fortified castra. Calabrian asceticism remained extraordinarily vibrant, with saints such as Melus of Rossano, died 1004, his disciple Bartholomew of Grottaferrata, Sabas the Younger, Fantinos the Younger, and Vitalis of Castronuovo, embodying a vigorous Italo-Greek monastic tradition that radiated influence as far as Rome and Monte Cassino. Many Greek monks and clerics migrated northward because of Arab raids, carrying relics in manuscripts and founding or refounding monasteries in Lazio and Campania. In Apulia, especially the Bari-Trani-Barletta Triangle and the Tavoliere, the majority remained Latin-speaking Longobards who followed the Roman Rite and Longobard law. Between these two zones lay a broad band of mixed communities where Greek and Latin clergymen, notaries, and landowners coexisted comfortably, often within the same family. Catapans and Byzantine officials lavishly endowed Latin churches and monasteries. Social hierarchy was dominated by a land-owning urban elite, archontes donatoi primati, who supplied judges, tourmarks, bishops, and rebel leaders alike. Below them were free peasant proprietors, tenant farmers, many paying the classic Byzantine triad of land tax, hearth tax, and corvée, artisans in the ports, and a growing number of dependent paroikoi attached to monasteries or lay lords. Arab raids repeatedly displaced Calabrian Greeks northward into Longobard territory, even to Roman Campania, while after 1018, Boioannes deliberately resettled thousands of Apulian Longobards into the new fortified towns of the Capitanata. Slavery persisted, mostly captives taken in raids or war, but the society was not servile in character. Pilgrimage traffic to Jerusalem via Apulian ports increased noticeably after roughly the year 1000, and the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre by Al-Hakim in 1009 was widely reported in both French and Italian sources as a stimulus for Western pilgrims, some of whom would linger as mercenaries. By 1025, the province had become markedly more urbanized and fortified than in 976, with the religious map showing deep Greek roots in Calabria and the Salento, a Latin Rite but often bilingual clergy in Apulia, and no systematic policy of Hellenization or Latinization from Constantinople. Loyalty was owed less to Greek or Latin than to city, king, and patron. The economy was predominantly agrarian and local, yet showed clear signs of recovery and modest growth in the final 15 years of Basil's reign. Gold coinage, numismata of Basil II and Constantine VIII, circulated sparingly. The everyday currency was the Sicilian Arab tari in Calabria and lower value Byzantine Milleresia and anonymous bronze fulles in Apulia. Hoards and single finds suggest that coin circulation increased noticeably after roughly 1010. Land values rose in secured zones, new villages were founded, churches and monasteries received larger donations, and the Catapan's own building program, fortresses, praetoria, churches, injected cash and employment. Fiscal pressure was real. Complaints about excessive taxation helped spark Melus's revolts, but the state extracted revenue efficiently through a mixture of direct assessment and farming to local notables. The province remained a net exporter of grain, oil, wine, timber, and later raw silk, while importing luxury textiles, glass, and spices via its ports. By 1025, the economy was markedly healthier and more monetized than half a century earlier, yet still far from the commercial dynamism that Amalfi, Salerno, and later Norman Bari would display. Trade was overwhelmingly maritime and concentrated in a handful of ports. Bari, Trani, Otranto, and outside direct Byzantine control, Salerno and Amalfi. Bari served as administrative and commercial capital, handling grain, oil, timber, and slaves from the hinterland in exchange for Constantinopolitan luxury goods and eastern spices. Venetian merchants enjoyed reduced duties after the 992 Chrysobull and regularly transported Byzantine troops in return. Their ships relieved Bari from Arab siege in 1002 and maintained the vital Adriatic lifeline when Bulgaria temporarily blocked overland routes. Amalfitans, despite living under Longobards princes, traded intensively with Constantinople and the Muslim world, often evading Byzantine restrictions. Jewish merchants appear frequently in documents and were specifically targeted in Basil's Venetian privilege. Long-distance luxury trade, silk, textiles, glass lamps, incense, ivory, remained modest in volume but highly visible in church treasuries. Arab raids disrupted coastal traffic until the early 11th century, but after roughly 1010, security improved and pilgrimage traffic to Jerusalem via Apulian ports grew noticeably. By Basil's death, southern Italy functioned as a commercial bridge between the Byzantine, Latin, and Islamic worlds rather than a major entrepot in its own right, but one whose ports were steadily regaining vitality. Artistic and architectural production was modest in scale, yet surprisingly vigorous, especially given the insecurity of the previous decades. Calabria and the Salento remained the heartland of Italo-Greek culture. Rock-cut hermitages and cave churches known as laure continued to be dug and painted, often with simple but expressive fresco cycles reflecting the ascetic spirituality of figures such as Melus of Rossano and his disciples. Excellent dated examples survive at Carpignano 1020 and in the crypt of St. Christina at Carpignano. Also use some of the pictures here. In Apulia, where Latin Rite patrons dominated, a distinctive school of church building emerged around 1025. Large three-aisled basilicas with transepts and domes over the crossing were erected or rebuilt at Bari, the old cathedral, Taranto, Otranto, St. Pietro there, Vieste, and Siponto, frequently with metropolitan Byzantine financial or technical support. Their sculptural decoration, capitals, transenne, altar screens blends late antique Apulian traditions with current Constantinopolitan fashions, peacocks, lions, and interlaced patterns executed in a crisp, almost graphic style. Manuscript production in the Greek zones never ceased. Several important 11th century South Italian Greek codices, for example the Typicon of St. Nilus for Grottaferrata or the lectionary Vatican Greek 2138, were copied in this period by scribes trained in Calabria or the Terra d'Otranto. Bronze doors, Bari Cathedral, Trani, Salerno, and precious metalwork, book covers, reliquaries were still largely imported from Constantinople, but local workshops in Bari and Salerno were beginning to imitate them. After roughly 1010, the Catapans themselves became major patrons. Basil Mesardonitus rebuilt the Praetorium in Bari. Basil Boioannes probably sponsored new churches in the fortified towns of the Capitanata. Economic indicators were uniformly positive. New basilicas rose at Bari, Taranto, Bovino, and Vieste under apparent metropolitan patronage. The frescoes of Carpignano are dated as we've seen to 1020. The mulberry groves of Calabria heralded expanding silk production. The Capitanata rapidly generated significant revenue at minimal administrative cost. by 1025, a modest but unmistakable revival was underway, laying the groundwork for the richer flowering of the later 11th and early 12th centuries. It was against this the background of neglect, devastation, and factional violence that the first great rebellion erupted in May 1009. Melus, or Melus of Bari, a wealthy and ambitious notable from Bari, probably of mixed Longobarд Armenian descent, and certainly Latin in culture and religion, whose family may originally have belonged to the old Armenian colony of the city, emerges as the most prominent local leader in Byzantine Apulia during the later part of Basil's reign. First attested in 1009, he organized a serious urban revolt against the Catapan John Kourkouras, briefly seizing Bari and several other Apulian cities before the rebellion was crushed in 1010-1011 by the new captain Basil Mesardonitas. Melus fled to Capua, his wife and son were sent as hostages to Constantinople, and his property was confiscated. He never sought simple independence for Bari on the Amalfitan or Venetian model. He appears rather to have aimed at replacing Greek Catapans with native Longobarд leadership while maintaining nominal allegiance to one or to the emperor. With his brother-in-law Dattus, he seized Bari, Ascoli, and Troia. Catapan John Kourkouras perished in the fighting. Constantinople reacted with unusual urgency. The new Catapan Basil Mesardonitas 1010-1016 assisted, if Skylitzes is correctly interpreted by the naval strategos Basil Argyros from Samos, besieged and retook Bari after 2 months, crushed remaining resistance by June 1011, and received the surrender of most rebel centers. Melus fled first to Benevent, then Salerno, and finally Capua. Mesardonitus immediately began reconstruction. He erected a fortified praetorium near the arbor on the future site of the Basilica of St. Nicholas, issued appeals for refugees to return under guarantee of safety, and conducted a demonstrative progress through Longobard territory to reassert imperial prestige. The respite lasted only 6 years. In 1016-1017, Melus, moving between the courts of the Longobard princes and the shrine of St. Michael on Monte Gargano, the most important pilgrimage site in Apulia since Italic times, recruited several hundred Norman pilgrims and exiles, promising land and plunder. The Roman presence in southern Italy effectively begins in embryonic form in the very last years of Basil II's reign and is inextricably linked to the 2 revolts of Melus. A small band of Norman pilgrims returning from Jerusalem, led by figures such as Gilbert Boiter and later Rainulf Durango, were recruited by Melus around 1016-1017 to bolster his second rebellion against Byzantine rule. These adventurers, probably no more than a few hundred in number, inflicted surprising defeats on Catapanal forces in 1017, 3 successive victories over Catapan, Contolio, and Tornikios, ravaging much of Apulia and coming close to destroying imperial authority in the province, but early victories encouraged fresh waves of Norman adventurers and alarmed Constantinople. In December 1017, Basil II appointed Basil Boioannes, in Italian sources Bojanus, Boianus, Greek Boioannes. The etymology may have been Bayan, because he was in fact a commander of possibly South Slavic or Bulgarian origin who had distinguished himself in the final Bulgarian campaigns as Catapan with plenary powers comparable to those once exercised by Nikephoros Uranos or David Areianites. He stands out as the single most effective Byzantine commander ever to serve in southern Italy and the architect of the empire's last great phase of authority there. Reinforced by troops released from the Danube front, including the elite Varangian Guard, specifically requested to face the Norman heavy cavalry, Boioannes won 3 successive engagements. In 1018, the decisive battle taking place in October on the historic ground of Cannae, the Second Battle of Cannae, the first one in the Second Punic War, beside the Ofanto River. The Norman leader Gilbert Boiter fell, Melus's army was annihilated. Apparently only 10 Normans survived, and he fled north, first to the Papal States and then to the court of Henry II at Bamberg in Franconia. I recently made a video about Bamberg's cathedral and the Friderician statue there at the Bamberg Reiter, so if you're interested, there is an interesting connection there. Here he was honorably received, and he was actually buried there too. He was honorably received and granted the empty title of Duke of Apulia, but died in 1020, broken and far from home, before Henry's expedition of 1021-1022 could achieve anything concrete. Surviving Normans initially dispersed, though most were crushingly defeated, and Gilbert was killed. Within a year, however, Boioannes pragmatically hired a Norman contingent to garrison the newly founded fortress city of Troy in 1019, thereby turning former enemies into salaried troops of the empire, and marking the first official Byzantine employment of Normans in Italy. Datus held out until June 1021 in his fortified tower on the Garigliano before being betrayed, brought to Bari and executed by drowning in a sack together with a monkey, cock, and snake. His repeated defeats and eventual death did not end the movement. He became a martyr figure for Apulian particularism, and his son Argyrus would later lead further anti-Byzantine risings in the 1040s. Boioannes transformed victory into permanent gain. The turning point came only after the annihilation of the Bulgarian Empire in 1018, and released the victorious Tagmata and Varangians for service in the West, marking the moment when the Western powers ceased to be predators and became, for a brief decade, objects of Byzantine manipulation. From 1017 onward, reinforcements including Varangians, Bulgarians, and Macedonians arrived. A chain of new fortresses was built across the Apulian plain and the Capitanata. In 1019, he founded the fortress city of Troia at the critical Apennine Pass, commanding the route into the Apulian plain, initially garrisoned with loyal Normans. Over the next decade, he created an entire defensive belt across the previously desolate Capitanata with new settlements at Civitate, Dragonara, Fiorentino, Montecorvino, Tertiveri, Melfi, Mottola, and others. Privileges issued in 1019 and renewed around 1024 deliberately invited Longobards settlers from the neighboring principalities by guaranteeing the continued application of Longobard law and the preservation of Latin ecclesiastical rights. The result was rapid colonization, the digging of irrigation canals, the building of mills, and the planting of vineyards, turning a former wilderness into one of the richest fiscal zones of the Catapanate within a single generation. Many Longobard families were forcibly resettled into the new fortified towns of the Capitanata, granted privileges under Longobard law, and bound more closely to imperial service. In the south, he fortified the Taranto hinterland with new strongholds against lingering Muslim raiding. Pandulf IV of Campo formally submitted, becoming an active Byzantine client. The Prince of Salerno accepted a comparable relationship when Henry II led a large army south in 1022 to dismantle the new order. He besieged Troia without success, briefly replaced Pandulf, and withdrew after his local alliances dissolved, achieving no lasting gains. In 1024, Boioannes even crossed the Adriatic, raided Croatia, and carried off the wife and son of King Krešimir III to Constantinople, momentarily reasserting imperial influence over the entire lower Adriatic basin and securing the Adriatic itself. By 1025, the balance of power among the Western actors had been almost completely reversed. The Chalbid Emirate was no longer capable of serious raiding. The Longobard princes were clients or neutralized. The independent Longobard princes had been reduced to clients, yet the Longobard element remained the demographic backbone of the province and would provide the social base for later anti-Byzantine feeling. Henry II's intervention had failed. Venice was bound by treaty and marriage. Pisa remained cooperative, and the first Normans, survivors of Cannae, were enlisted as garrison troops. At Basil's death in 1025, the Norman element remained tiny, scattered, and still under imperial pay rather than independent. The great wave of conquest that would sweep the Byzantines from the peninsula belongs to the decades after 1030. With Bulgaria next and Italy pacified, Basil II turned to the objective that had eluded every emperor since Constans II, 641-668, the reconquest of Arab Sicily. The aborted Byzantine expedition to reconquer Sicily in 1025 represented the culmination of Basil II's lifelong ambition to eliminate the last major Muslim stronghold in the western Mediterranean and secure the empire's southern Italian provinces once and for all. For decades, raids from Chalbid Sicily and Zirid North Africa had repeatedly devastated Calabria and threatened Apulia, exposing the vulnerability of the Catapanate despite the defensive successes of commanders like Basil Boioannes. In 1024-1025, a huge expeditionary force began to assemble, drawn from the victorious armies of the Balkans and the East. A diverse expeditionary contingent comprising Rus, that is Varangians, Bulgarians, Vlachs, Turks, Macedonians, and others. The Catapan Boioannes and the eunuch Orestes, a veteran of the Bulgarian and Eastern campaigns who had already led an advance party to Messina, landing, in fact, across the strait, rebuilding the fortifications of Reggio Calabria as a staging point, and may have briefly occupied, in fact, parts of northeastern Sicily himself, were placed in joint command. The main army concentrated at Reggio, where the walls were rebuilt and mulberry plantations, the raw material for the Calabrian silk industry that would flourish in the following decades, were probably established at this time. Basil himself intended to lead the final invasion in person, an undertaking that would have required a large fleet, probably relying heavily on Venetian allies. Before the emperor could depart Constantinople or the full invasion force across the Strait of Messina, however, Basil died suddenly on December 15, 1025, at the age of 67. His brother and successor Constantine VIII immediately cancelled the operation, recalling the troops and abandoning any immediate hope of reconquest. The abrupt termination of the expedition marked the effective high-water mark of Byzantine power under Basil, although a more famous attempt under Georgios Maniakes in 1038-1040 would achieve temporary successes. The empire never again came so close to recovering Sicily, which remained under Muslim rule until the Norman conquest beginning in 1061. At the moment of the emperor's death, the Byzantine position in southern Italy was stronger than at the time, since the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Direct imperial rule extended across an enlarged and pacified Apulia and Calabria. Client relationships bound major Lombard principalities. The Adriatic was secured through Venetian alliance and Croatian submission. The Capitanate had been transformed from wilderness to prosperous frontier. Administration rested on a thin superstructure of centrally appointed catapans and tagmatic officers, superimposed upon a deep substrate of local Lombard law, Latin clergy, and indigenous office holders that were marcae, gastals, judices, and bishops, that were almost invariably local men, often rewarded with multiple sees, and even the new city of Troia was placed directly under papal jurisdiction with the agreement of John XIX. At Basil's death, the Catapanate was militarily stronger and territorially more secure than at any time since the 9th century, yet it remained critically dependent on troops and money diverted from other fronts on fragile alliances with Venice and local Lombard principalities. The underlying structural weakness, lack of a permanent fleet, and a large indigenous army would become fatal in the following decades. Modern understanding of Byzantine southern Italy under Basil II rests primarily on a combination of sources that complement and correct one another, since the principal Byzantine narrative historian John Skulitz treats Italy only in a handful of very terse passages, and the later Byzantine tradition largely ignores Italy. The richest and most continuous thread is provided by the South Italian annals and short chronicles written inside the Byzantine territories themselves, above all the three related redactions of the Annals of Bari, the Annales Barenses, Lupus Protospatarius, and the Anonymous Barenses. particularly valuable for the precise chronology of the arrival and departure of catapans and other officials, Arab raids, taxation, revolts, notably those of Melus in 1009, 1011, and 1017, 1018, and the activities of the great catapan Basil Boioannes after 1017. They are supplemented by minor local chronicles from neighboring Lombard principalities, for example, the Chronicle of Salerno, and by the entries in Lupus Protospatarius that extend into the 40s of the 11th century. A second major group consists of archived material surviving in the original or in early copies. Several hundred Latin and a smaller number of Greek private and public documents, charters, judgments, donations, inventories preserved especially in the archives of Monte Cassino, Cava, Bari, Trani, Conversano, and Salerno. When combined with xylographic, that is lead seals of officials, and occasional epigraphic evidence, these give concrete detail on day-to-day administration, landholding, taxation, the coexistence of Greek and Lombard law, and the names, titles, and tenures of local and centrally appointed officials that the literary sources almost completely omit. From northern Italy, the most sustained contemporary narrative is the Historia Venetorum of John the Deacon, finished in roughly around 1008, which repeatedly describes Venetian Byzantine diplomatic, commercial, and military cooperation in the Adriatic sphere. Hagiographical texts in both Greek and Latin are surprisingly informative, especially the lives of Southern Italian or Calabrian saints, composed in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The Vita Nili Junioris by a monk of Rossano, written roughly in 1020, 1030. The Vita Sabba Junioris by Orestes, Patriarch of Jerusalem. The Vita Luce Abbatis, the Vita Gregorio of Cassano, and others. These often contain precise chronological references to catapans, Arab raids, and the movement of Byzantine officials, as well as vivid descriptions of social conditions and emigration from Calabria. Western narrative sources outside Italy are sparse and unusually indirect, but occasionally useful. Thietmar of Merseburg died in 1018 for occasional diplomatic contacts from a German perspective, naturally. The French chroniclers Rodolphus Glaber and Adhemar of Chabannes, both writing in the 1020s, 1030s, for the arrival of Norman pilgrims/mercenaries and the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009. In very late 11th century Norman texts, the most famous ones, William of Apulia, Matus of Monte Cassino, Geoffrey Malaterra, for the revolts of Melus and the early Norman penetration, even though they were written half a century or more after the events, Arabic sources are almost silent except for very occasional mentions in Ibn al-Athir and other later compilers referring to raids from Sicily or Ifriqiya. This corpus, despite its fragmentary and disparate character, is in fact unusually rich for a Byzantine provincial periphery in the early 11th century and permits a far more detailed reconstruction that is possible for most other frontiers of Basil's empire. Yet this late triumph was built upon two fatally weak foundations: the personal authority of an aging emperor who left no successor of comparable talent, the rapidity with which Boioannes' system later collapsed under weaker successors and larger Norman invasions, only underlines the extent to which the late Byzantine revival in Italy was the achievement of one exceptionally able and energetic individual backed for a brief window by the full resources of Basil II's empire at its zenith, and the failure to capture Sicily, which alone could have provided the permanent naval security and strategic depth that the mainland provinces required. The Norman mercenaries, first introduced by Melus and briefly employed by Boioannes, would ultimately exploit both weaknesses, but in the winter of 1025-1026, the western frontier of the empire stretched farther than it had for 400 years and appeared, for one brief moment, entirely secure. For one luminous moment, the Western powers that had preyed upon or contested Byzantine Italy for half a century were reduced to subordination or irrelevance, and the empire's frontier stood farther west than any time since the age of Heraclius. So my lungs are exhausted after this, because it's easier to make maybe a longer video, but not simply reading so straightforwardly. But you can hear me anyway. So what do we get from this? Today, again, there was just so much time in the stream to discuss this, and of course they're wrapping that up. Probably, let me see if they finished it anyway. Again, first of all, it was a pretty sort of important. They're still streaming, by the way. Pretty important occasion that you could use, obviously, in any sort of for this 1,000 year of Basil II. It's sort of shocking to think, up to yesterday was 1,000 years, less than 1,000 years, close to Basil II. It's 1,000. It fits the scale of the epicness, so to say. As far as southern Italy, so first of all, today in the streaming, there was this, it was pointed out that the Byzantines did not really care so much about the Western frontier. This is true, right? But one has to understand why, because there are actually two major dynamics at play, as we've seen even just by documentation, by general development. Like, southern Italy was not poor, right? It was troubled, it was fragmented. There is all a previous history to this, which largely actually imputes to Byzantine history like a broader failure. This is kind of obvious. Like, the reason why southern Italy became southern Italy historically is largely connected with this, with the general disorder that this southern Lombard and Byzantine frontier had, become, differently from other parts, again, of Italy, that were much better administered, regulated, homogeneously governed. Even if they were all sort of different centers, they had been framed within a kingdom. They had some great level of sort of, at this point, proto-communal development. I also discussed this. Like, if you're interested, I will post some videos down below, all connected with this. But what was there before the Italian communes, right? Those cities were basically already running themselves by themselves. This is the age of the bishops, counts, mostly the Neotonian period. Now, the other point is, in Italy there is Rome, and Basil II's reign is after the Phocian schism, but in general, like, it was still a moment in which you couldn't quite sort of straightforwardly separate a clean, like, I don't know, Catholic or Orthodox, separate. It doesn't mean much, right? Because Catholic and Orthodox are actually superimposable terms. The church was Catholic since its very inception by sort of ecclesiastical definition, not my thing. Do you know that Catholicism existed before Christianity? And Orthodox too. Like, Orthodox is just an attribution, right? It's doctrinally Orthodox. And so these are also pretty lame. Individually, they're exceptional, but the separation, the categorical separation based on that, doesn't make much sense. The real thing behind this is naturally that there was a Byzantine control, especially the coastal dimension, as we premised at the beginning of this video, that, as I pointed out in the streaming, did not really push that much to essentially affirm itself in the hinterland. First of all, again, the southern Italian hinterland was a nightmare to conquer. Constans II had tried to besiege Benevent, and he had failed. In general, the Longobards will become like a very tough nut to crack, even for the Normans. So in a much more successfully, at least tendentially cohesive system, as sort of the kingdom of Sicily will become, also on the Italian mainland. And we talked a bit about this. We talked about the Langobardia Major, but we have to talk in general more about southern Italian history, because otherwise you don't understand all the connections if you're not familiar with it. But there are various stages. And so what I think my script rightly points out is how brief at the end of the day, and somehow, can say simply accidental, but contingential, this partial revival of Byzantine southern Italy was. The Normans would make this land flourish, really, in a functional sense. The Byzantines were just basically, there is no major regional power around, right? This place is far away from all major powers, Byzantine one included. The Ottonians, the same Muslims of Sicily, were not even this regional threat, if not by pirates, brigands, as we've seen here. The Longobards side would really deserve some more videos, because I think I made only one video on the southern Longobards per se, and after the fall of the Longobard kingdom. That you would like to appreciate this further. Now, the point being that if you are a Roman emperor, you want to control Rome. And Rome, until the 12th century, until essentially the later Komnenian era, will remain more or less straddling these two worlds, also just by papal convenience. I mean, they had greater influence on these massive empires that they ideally controlled. And also in pretty explicit terms, right? Rome laid in the West at this point, like in more straightforward terms, the same Byzantines had realized that by the time of Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, basically. But still, like, the connection with the rest of Constantinople was obvious. And also, just if you consider the coastal dimension, we've seen here how many, for example, southern Italian maritime cities existed that had this tendentially autonomous trend. We made a video about Amalfi, that is the first of the, canonically speaking, the Italian maritime republics, that is in southern Italy. And when the Normans come, they basically repress this sort of local autonomies, whereas central northern Italian ports will take off. In many ways, we've seen here Venice as well, that was in any case very much independent, right? This is autonomous, to say the least. This is a very big difference from anything you see in the East. In the East, you don't see any of this. You don't see some autonomous powers can hold themselves on their own. You don't see sort of the thriving maritime republics doing stuff. It's all much more centralized, or at least concentrated in Constantinople. And mostly there is a thalassocratic tendency to clear the coastal areas. We've seen that here. What was the major goal? Sicily. Sicily was easier to conquer because the Arabs were actually weak there. I talked about this in the streaming. But in order to concretely advance as a regional force into southern Italy towards the center, for example, in a broader reconquest perspective, there was no other way but from there, even though, as we've seen, there were resources, to do it so by conquering Sicily. That admittedly was also what would be chosen by the Normans to rule from in their reign, also controlling the southern Italian mainland. And there are many reasons for this. I have an entire series about medieval Sicilian, sort of various dominations of Sicily throughout the Middle Ages. What matters in general, it seems to me, that the Byzantine grip on the southern territories of the peninsula was feeble. All right, that even though Basil II was a bit the peak of Macedonian resurgency, and also in a truly expansionistic direction, aside from the fact that he died, and it was possible for Sicily to be reconquered, but we do not know to which extent this could have been carried out. And for how protractedly. What you realize is that this enterprise largely depended on some sort of Italian support, right? Primarily the maritime republics from a naval point of view. And at that point, to do what at the end of the day? To find, instead of the Saracens, a Byzantine empire, right? With the Germans from the north and the Byzantines from the south. That doesn't quite add up. Right, we don't know how the expedition would have gone, but it may be hyper hyped. I'm not saying that. I'm not referring to the streaming now, but in general, this is my impression. It is my impression, generally speaking, for the Byzantine capacity to expand in an area like across the peninsula, rising up the Apennine Peninsula, against much more courageous powers. In fact, in the streaming, I brought up the example of what was essentially the plan. This was well explained by Paul Magdaleno, for example, in his work about for Emmanuel Comnenus' attempt at almost successful, by the way, attempt at destruction of the Siculo-Norman kingdom. That would, however, not really led to a Byzantine occupation of southern Italy, if not in a coastal sense as usual. It would have largely witnessed to interland power sharing between Constantinople and the papacy instead. So again, the Byzantine capacity to simply reconquer the interland was not something here that was even attempted. What you've seen with Boioannes was basically just creating this protective belt from the mountainous interland where the Longobards launched raids across the fertile Apulian plain, right? And so we see a fairly modest capacity of control, regardless of the wide resources. We've seen the exports of this era were historically big. Again, they will support one of the single most successful and power concentrated kingdoms in the history of high medieval Europe. So there is no doubt that this land was incredibly resourceful in potential, and that the Byzantines basically did not have the time, the opportunity, but not even the capacity at large to recompact in more functional ways. Right? It's always this. I think Eastern Roman history was correct in pointing out that, of course, this largely depended on the usual Byzantine issues, coups, other wars such as the one against Bulgaria. And it's obvious that also the distance with the West was, sort of geographically speaking, from a strategical, logistical point, sort of relatively prohibited. Also, as I pointed out in the same streaming, at that point, the Byzantine Empire was normally skewed toward the east, like in terms of strategic balance of power. The Anatolian hinterland was basically the only true landmass where the Byzantines controlled like an entire bulk of a country, aside from the coastal dimension, right? And there were also many opportunities that arose, and the empire was incredibly powerful, but in this sense shifted mostly towards the east. And for reasons that had historically had to do, of course, with Islamic expansions, etc. That's also why, for example, Byzantine southern Italy could handle itself largely by itself. It was left on its own. It had sort of pretty scarce central government forces to protect it. But in this sense, it still could stand on its legs because socio-culturally it was consistent, and it mostly there was a lot of substance in southern Italy. But the Byzantines, what it lacked was a form, right? The Byzantines could not really give it, right? So the Normans will succeed in doing that. And again, this was a major land. In fact, what we shouldn't, but also people who studied this in Byzantine historiographical perspective, look at this and try, as you understand, like most of what we read here is also basically based on what Vera von Falkenhausen said, and I think she's very correct, in stating how, also again, unimpressive the Byzantine hold and grip on the system was, right? But they, as Byzantinists, don't necessarily look at the bigger picture, also in a comparative sense. They study this within the Byzantine Empire and say, well, more or less, we notice that in fact things could or couldn't or wouldn't be always going the best way. But the point is also trying to see southern Italy in a broader regional sense. I mean, had this thing been united, which the Normans successfully achieved, like in the 12th century, by also, again, with the single highest power concentration in medieval Europe, even more than the Kingdom of England, the idea is that how actually, as a whole, resourceful this thing was. How much the fact that the Byzantine shortcomings shouldn't deflect like the comparison here, not much with Norman times, but how much Western territories, although more distant and less sort of interacting with Constantinople, were powerful in its own, how the West was already ahead. Even a region like southern Italy that had been suffering sort of chronicle sort of political fragmentation since the Longobards invasion, or even before, like given the exhaustion of the the so-called Greek Gothic War. That's the comparison that I think should be pointed out. How, while, again, Basil II is big, and the empire is large and everything, the actual capacity of the Byzantines to simply recompact a region like southern Italy is not there. For this mix of factors, but probably, I think, because finding this region inherently required spending an enormous amount of resources for a type of conquest that the Byzantines didn't have the capacity to conduct. Maybe Muslim Sicily would have actually faltered and collapsed. The Byzantines may even have retaken it. We don't know how, however. It's still growing dependent and indebted in the sense on the Italians that at this point were also literally taking off. We've seen it in many videos about medieval trade. And surely, like as we've seen, we named Amalfi, Pisa, Venice, etc., would have predatorily tried to subcontract to place themselves already in southern Italy, sort of, in this sense, also much earlier than they did after, to compare to what they would, in fact, do under the Normans, for different reasons. Because, in fact, that compaction would happen generations later in a successful sense, especially with Sicily. It took like 30 years, so you have to wait probably the end of the 11th century. And as a consequence, also, if they had wanted instead to push against the first polities existing essentially from southern Italy northwards, namely the Longobards duchies, yes, this could sort of declare themselves as client states, but historically they had never been controlled, nor by the Carolingians, the Ottonians, nor by the Byzantines. And so every time you even launch massive campaign there, like, where did you want to go? It would have been probably more feasible to besiege Ancona at that point, or to have, or I'm just throwing it there like that, but say attacking those areas for a permanent control of the southern Italian hinterland would have arisen a hornet nest, right? And it would have awoken like a storm, especially from the empire. The papacy would have also felt threatened. So what we see in southern Italy is a sort of stagnation, a sort of, nobody's gaining the upper hand. It's not actually a matter of lack of local potential development. If anything, there is just not a unitary government and something in the sense uniformly efficient that can lead it in an autonomous way. That's the history of southern Italy at that point. It's rather the fact that everybody was more or less okay for this power vacuum to exist. Right? The Byzantines, because nobody would threaten the coastal possessions they had. The Longobards, because they were themselves there, they didn't want anyone controlling them. The papacy, because they did not want anyone, like either German emperors or the Byzantine ones, to control the south and surround them. The same Italian maritime republics were, in a sense, at this point, turning the tides against the Saracens and flourishing exactly in this fragmentation, in this ambiguity, where they could individually direct their own political and strategic resources in a very surgical way to strike here and there and to cash all the markets and sort of to cause that massive trade balance shift that we very well know of at the time. And so that's the impression I received. It's not much. It's the reconfirmation actually of some Western advancement. You've seen there how the French, the Italians were already talking about Jerusalem, how the same Jerusalem talk about Italy, southern Italy at that point. So how that bridge that will actually lead to the Crusades, with this Norman pilgrims, by the way, already escorting the faithful to the Holy Land and so on, was already there, right? And the 11th century, in this sense, is one of the most, in my opinion, underrated periods. We made really lots of videos about the 11th century. Because, but never enough, because it's a period that people still, let's say, think of this era, I don't know, as the late Viking era. They don't picture normally that the Western Mediterranean, for example, was witnessing to the tidal reversal of civilization and the taking over of the Italian maritime republics, but also will become the communes in the hinterland, a level of important autonomy, also a relative functionality of the Italic kingdom. We've seen it with different rulers. Well, actually, it was the investiture controversy was a mess, but I mean, later also, before Barbarossa, were Lothar III, Conrad III, like still functional reigns. And so that entire picture is normally removed. It's as if it were not important. It's as if these polities were not cohesively actually the most important forces, the greatest powers agitating in the West at that point, just because, again, you fixate just on the bigger kingdom, or the bigger empire, the one that on the map looks the largest continuous colored blob of some sort. That's not exactly how I see it itself, and I think that overall we are in obvious realization of the usual perspectival distortion that we tend to have in sometimes magnifying the Byzantines, because I personally love the Byzantines. I wouldn't make these videos, I wouldn't talk so much about them, but I've always, like, Schwerpunkt has always been like this regarding the sort of the topic, like this notion that you have been betrayed, because I literally had people back in the day saying this, because nobody told you Byzantine history, so it's as if as Westerners we should have a collective guilt because we allegedly never studied it. No, it's you who have never studied it. The Westerners were the first ones who studied the Byzantine Empire since the Renaissance, and we are the only ones who made Byzantinistics happen. But no, because they weren't called Byzantines, they were Roman. There's all this whiny narrative that for some reason it's not much just we owe something to the Byzantines, because again they're very great, big, important civilization. They're magnificent, they were powerful, they were advanced and everything. But it's rather like the fact that we're sabotaging ourselves as Westerners and not really seeing the intrinsic limits of the Byzantine Empire to an extent, and instead sort of treating the West as some sort of black hole of barbarism, while we already had the civilization upper hand at this point in ways that are never represented in pop culture. And southern Italy is also a liminal scenario here, before the Norman conquest that will actually bring this place to the stars in a broader sense. You have to understand there also how messy southern Italy really was. And so that's why I choose that, because it's actually one of the places where you should, by European standards, it was actually a very rich place, but there's no comparison with the orderly institutional development of central northern Italy, or even the papacy for that matter. This place was broken, right? Ecclesiastical administration was messed up, like there were all these, say, in strictly juridical. Why? Because there is no authority, there is no order. Who's controlling these places? The Byzantines. It's them who lost the stuff to the Saracens. It's them that, well, we can argue that there was a greater crisis in the 9th century, of course, but we're talking here the end of the 10th, beginning of the 11th. The Byzantines had de facto carried out also very successful reconquests of Calabria. There are like very striking sort of campaigns that show how mostly the Byzantine Empire was functional at sea, and so capable of true naval forces, polyracetics, their own forces brought from different places to actually reinforce the coastal image. That's what the Byzantines only cared about, if you really look at it attentively, outside of Anatolia. All right, even the wars against the Bulgarians was mostly about sort of laying them waste, than having some sound grip, so to say, on the overall picture of, let's say, excuse me, I'm checking something here, deciding whether to insert the Bayeux tapestry pictures or not for this video. Very cool, because there are the Normans, right? I saved them all, and there are lots of other pictures, so I will probably keep them, even though there are sort of more pertaining Southern Italian pictures of the Normans here. Well, but anyhow, you realize how this is, and so in a way, again, what I said. But you can find this mostly the product of some general lack of comprehensive perspective on medieval history. That's as always on Schwerpunkt what I always pointed out. The fact that we barely have a unitary, cohesive, kind of understood sense of the Middle Ages, mostly because people tend to study the Middle Ages as picking their own place and saying, oh, well, this was good no matter what, right? Because it's mine. And the rest, well, I don't know anything about that because literally I never heard of it. You actually know nothing even about your own place most of the time. But you lack this comparative awareness. And if somebody shows you that a place was better than yours, you will have your feelings hurt or this kind of things. And that's mostly what drives people. Like for different reasons, I've been on X recently because I'm sharing different stuff, and now I don't do it anymore. But I got entangled into this sort of weird, the sort of weird posting that X has become about in history. Like this comparative aspect is completely skipped. Like people who talk history even at some important level of awareness, but mostly revolving just about identity and not having the capacity of why things happen as causes proper. So again, difficult stories to make, but it's a point we'll have to do. Like an interesting video would be this year I think I made a couple of videos about southern Italy more that were really necessary because we didn't talk about it so much. And here let me see how many videos I made about medieval southern Italy. Really just 2022. It's too few, right? Should be much more. Like at this point I should have at least 40 to have to say, okay, well, we have covered it in some relevant. We never talk about Sardinia in a single dedicated video to that on. You really have to do more and to show why, again, these places are very important to know about. They're not French or not strange or not, and just because the Saracens hanging around, it's not means that this were not valuable places. And actually, as we've seen, this southern Italian context also. For example, Nicole says, now that I think about it, something on the pattern, if I go by memory, that fortification of southern Italy during this early period may have been a response also to some kind of lack of unitary defense. Because had there been a functional military there, cities would have not needed to fortify themselves, towns to fortify themselves with their own militias that were actually the most developed in the Byzantine Empire. Again, how often have you heard of this? Like the southern Italian urban militias, town militias, were actually the most advanced in the entire Byzantine Empire. This is also intuitively obvious if you think about, again, a normal comparison between what the West was being at the time and Byzantine society in general. Like, but it's something that you never even hear once, right? And it may be what Nicole says, by the way, that is true, that of course that this, because southern Italian towns would not evolve again as the communes of the north. And this is not just because of the Normans, by the way. It's because of the previous condition of southern Italy, all right, that escaped some broader form of power concentration, more orderly administration, government. And again, that's where you find somebody else. And in this sense, also what people don't like to hear, because people today, especially this is a thing coming from the United States, some sort of weird attitude. The idea of state is negative, right? As if you could measure civilization, or at least the value of people, the less of a state it had. That generating concepts like, I don't know, the Scandinavians didn't have a state, so they lived better. No, they didn't. Right? People trying to say, oh, states at this point were important just because of people concentration, because there wasn't a great difference in wealth. Are you kidding me? Do you have an idea of how that the same Italian peninsula, for example, alone remained the richest per capita land in the entire world uninterruptedly since the Roman Empire up to the 17th century. How do we put that? Or how do we put that even, I don't know, contemporary Italy, even putting into the account that southern Italy that lowers the average is richer per capita than Sweden, right? That's not something you can't simply hide. You must explain it in a way. And in any case, the state, right? People have become state phobic. They think that the state is this totalitarian regime that has no, it doesn't even sort of understand that they live in states anyway, that the basic needs that they rely on by lifeline are state-based, because they, as people, are too incapable of running any of that, right? And so they have also this myth of, but if you are, I don't know, a farmer out there into the wilderness, you will actually live better, you will actually survive. Like, states were born exactly to fix that, because life sucked, right? And so it's weird how, I was talking about it also yesterday in the video about Harald Hardrada, how, for example, a figure like that is very famous, very well received. Well, because the Viking era, because also he was, again, very cool and so on. But do we want to reflect on the fact that there were so many great rulers all over, I don't know, post-Carolingian Europe that nobody routinely gives a freaking damn about? Because just, we didn't happen to be so obsessed with the Viking era, mostly from an Anglosphere perspective. That's the problem. Right, as long as we go on like this, aside from all the sort of the ethnocultural biases and so on, like, we will never understand the actual meaning, identity, and power of Europe. If you want to try to exclude these places for some odd reason from the account, we'll never understand European history. And that's also the reason, again, why I made this video, because I don't talk about southern Italy myself that much, but I realized that it is actually necessary. And this place, especially up to the 18th century, was very much advanced, and it should have actually received a much wider pop cultural interest that we don't really see. Right? And I'm sure I'm not running here tests as I usually do at the end of videos, trying to see whether people have already made videos on the same topic, because I know that nobody has, and but in general, like, it's funny to participate to these streamings. It's actually the first time I do it, because the one with Veritas and Caritas was a recorded interview. It wasn't like a streaming thing, and this thing was nice, because if anything, everyone brought their own thing, and that's good. I think it was a fair way to celebrate a ruler like Basil II really deserves, in ways that are a bit difficult to explain. And again, the oddity, as I was saying before, state is okay. I mean, it's not okay, apparently, now we're west of it, but everybody whines about, oh, look at how great the Byzantine, but that was the hyper-state, and especially also compared to the West. So I gotta give that there is no doubt. You can have a state also with a much greater level of autonomy, and there is no doubt about this. And even in certain circumstances, that's definitely the case. But it doesn't mean that the state is also just going to fail, or that the greatest civilizations were de facto all states. Otherwise, they wouldn't even exist, or they would collapse. I mean, look at the Mongols, right? Just a wave of conquerors. At the end of the day, if you count China out, what did they actually achieve? Like, the Mongols kept living as nomads in the steppes, even after Genghis Khan, right? So, and it's not they went anywhere for that, as we unfortunately see also with communism and everything. So the problem is big and can't be really taken away. People are relativistic, ignorant in general, first and foremost, uninterested in actual analysis, criticism. Again, this has absolutely nothing to do, obviously enough, if I hadn't been already clear about this with the streaming I made. But in general, this is my Schwerpunkt and reflection and criticism and so on. There are also very interesting numbers of things we could consider. For example, I found it very interesting. One, I think it was Al-Athir, the Arab who claimed that the Arab sources claimed that the Adriatic was a Venetian lake at that point, literally, like I said, in Arab. You see, even in this narrative, how do people see Venice, the projection of maritime power? right? It's all seems, even from these narratives, as if the Adriatic was essentially a Byzantine thing. But it quite wasn't. You can argue, well, but Venice was still within the... Yeah, right, but it was already since the pacts with the Carolingians in the early 9th century, sort of treating Western Eastern Empire pretty evenly, right? And they were just expanding because they benefited, because they could already offer to the empire something that the empire could not afford on its own. And why? Because it was something different. It was not an Eastern power, it was a Western one. And a hell of an aggressive, unprejudiced, really exceptional, effervescent. It's how do you measure this otherwise? Again, so it's always interesting to measure this. Also because we're looking here at the same level of latitudinal development. I mean, it's obvious that northern or Eastern Europe weren't this particularly advanced, to say the least. But if you look at the Mediterranean, I think it's very illustrative, exemplificative, very, very useful, because it shows actually a civilization that in theory, as you've been told, this was all Romanity. You shouldn't say Byzantine, you should say Roman, because we all were Romantic. And in the West, they kind of didn't have it anymore because they were bad. No, right? All right. The greatest level of advancement remained continuously in places like Italy, Gaul, Spain, even though the Muslims even there did not fully achieve eventually what they intended to achieve, whereas the Westerners, so France and Italy, remained literally at the head of medieval civilization. What about the Byzantines? Well, they wouldn't. Guess why? And again, it's mostly a matter of projections, of tags, of sort of unfair and non-objective judgment, and something else that it's at this point, like, I'm probably the only channel on the entire platform that talks about this very stuff. And I'm telling you that you will never find this interpretation, because actually if you ask a historian in general, they know that intuitively. If I asked some of my colleagues or also general professors of everywhere, like they do know that. They give it for granted, but they also research and teach it in ways that normally does not lead to where I am. And so I find my type of research relatively unique in its own kind. I really like a leitmotif of my actual publications is what you see in part, regardless of the topics that vary. But the sort of almost the shocker effect of showing people that essentially the most important parts of history at some point have not been even acknowledged as such, or at least they have been acknowledged in ways that are obviously resenting of some broader strange bias that you can easily document as well. So history is also largely empirical, where you can have a great capacity of abstraction in explaining these things, but it still must rest on some actual evidence, support. For example, it's not like the Byzantine Empire had, I don't know, people stopped to these things, lower crop yield than, I don't know, the Mediterranean areas. It's really say the Western areas, it's really debatable. The point is that how a civilization develops has nothing to do with those socio-economical materialistic determinism. It has rather to do with what form you give to this substance. And that's a concept that in order to acquire should essentially abandon the entire structuralism and materialism you've been enforced in historical explanation, and really see that if you really want to appreciate history, you have to understand politics, moral forces, warfare, all things that have been largely removed, not just the subject, probably in their original culture, in their original methodology, in the original works, right? As if, no, we don't study battles anymore because they're not important, or they're not, I don't know, they don't tell you the bigger picture. Why? Why can't they tell? They do, as a matter of fact. But that's because people don't know what they're discussing. They're just parroting somebody else's ideas. Or just think that there are people on YouTube still running channels saying, oh my God, so fascinated by structuralism because this was such a thing. It was 70 years ago, right? It's there's nothing like we surpassed that. Like you're not edgy or cool or, because you say, oh my God, from history of politics or war, the past to socioeconomics, it's so important. It's 70 years ago, right? People who wrote that are all dead now, right? You still think it's something actual or relevant? What about the entire West got skewed because of Marxism exactly in that direction, because that's what they were doing at the time. That's basically said the thing we're completely veering off from right now. But the problem is that at this point, in any case, mission accomplished in the sense that everybody lost the sense of what history is anyway. So nobody gets it anymore, if not by so with these cliches that were inherited from the more recent form of ideologism regarding that. So yeah, this is I like these topics. I don't hide it. I like especially making sense of the wall, if I can, through these pieces. Otherwise I would have not made over 2600 videos. And again, I want to thank Eastern Roman History for the opportunity to speaking on his channel. He also is roughly 30,000 like me, and he has more visibility on single videos for some reason, and he has better graphics rather than mine. But up to a certain point, at least I use more pictures, not in him, but in general, like on YouTube. I have a more sort of particular type of storytelling, not just also visually speaking, for that matter. I'm more atmospheric, so to say, or more dense in that kind of also ideological implication, even through a visual standpoint. I wanted to say something important, but I forgot. In fact, not just for participating, for giving me just the chance to make a research on this topic, because otherwise, honestly, I don't think I would have made a video about, in particular, southern Italy in the reign of Basil II. I mean, I'm sure it's a topic that could have sort of emerged somehow, but I would have not necessarily cut it just during Basil II's reign. And instead, you grow also with this stuff, because, again, that's what we all need. I'm particularly tired now, and I understand why. It's not the flu, nothing like this. I'm just perhaps exhausted because of the work. It's not even that late, but it's more or less the time I go to bed. And I would like to say more. I could actually stay here for a couple of hours explaining this. And perhaps I should, but again, I can't think of any particular reason here why we should get there looking at weird things once again on X mostly videos that are not down the rabbit hole. But and this video also makes pendant with the video made yesterday about Harald Hardrada, right? And as such, the here I was thinking that we could make this titling better. The Harald Hardrada's videos, because they have to understand it's a series. Otherwise people don't watch it, really. How they think I'm just talking about Harald Hardrada in a broad sense, but this is it. All right, and again, I for today stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.